Hello. Thank you for joining me for this last class in our series, Historical Backgrounds for Biblical Studies. We'll be considering the end of Second Temple Judaism. As you'll recall, the first temple, built by Solomon, was destroyed at the time of the Babylonian captivity. 70 years later, when the Jews returned from captivity, one of the first tasks that they had was to rebuild the temple and to begin the sacrificial services once again. This temple remained in operation until AD 70, when it was destroyed during the Jewish revolt against Rome. With the destruction of the temple in AD 70, many elements of Jewish life changed forever. In Jerusalem, you can see the last remnant of this last temple. The Western Wall, what is often called the Wailing Wall, because for many years Jews would come there and lament the loss of Jerusalem. When we look at what happened with the destruction of the temple, of course we see the end of the Levitical system. The priest could no longer offer the sacrifices, and for that reason the role of the priest among the Jews disappeared and was assumed by teachers of the law, not by those who were hereditary priests. This, of course, meant the end of the Sanhedrin. The Sanhedrin was a body of 70, with the high priest being the 71st vote, the chair of the assembly. This was a body that was largely comprised of priests and therefore Sadducees, although there were Pharisees on the Sanhedrin. With the destruction of Jerusalem and of the temple, the Sanhedrin was disbanded. There was therefore a greater emphasis upon synagogues. Synagogue is a Greek word that just simply means coming together to learn. Many Jews refer to their synagogues as schools. They are places where they come for instruction. We don't know exactly when synagogues arose. Seemingly, it was during the Babylonian captivity. They, of course, were overshadowed by the temple and those connected with the temple, although Jewish synagogues existed throughout the Jewish world, both in Palestine and in the dispersion. We read, of course, that Jesus regularly went to the synagogue on the Sabbath day. After the destruction of the temple, these gatherings and a synagogue only required 10, and still to this day only requires 10 Jewish families to constitute one. These assemblies would become the centerpiece of Jewish life. Towards the end of the first century, there was apparently a council of Jamnia. And I say apparently because not much information exists concerning this council. But either in this council or in the time at this council supposedly occurred at the end of the first century, two major things occurred. First of all, the canon, the listing of Jewish books, the sacred books, was set. Now, it had obviously been considered earlier, but it was formalized, and the Jews follow in their Bible what Protestants follow in the Old Testament. Catholics have added additional books, but this came much later. At the Council of Jamnia also, it was set that you could not believe in Jesus Christ and still be a Jew. This airtight barrier between Judaism and Christianity is one that persists today. If you are born a Jew but convert to Christianity, you are no longer considered Jewish. If you go to the state of Israel, you don't have the automatic right of return. On the other hand, if you're born a Jew but become an atheist, you still are able to return. You're still considered Jewish. The Council of Jamnia, or at least at that time, late in the first century, set these two standards. that the Old Testament, as we refer to it, the Hebrew Bible, was set, and Christians were excluded. The Babylonian Talmud was completed around the year 500. There was a slightly earlier Jerusalem Talmud that was completed in Palestine. This was a codification of the oral law, the tradition of the elders. Most Jews followed the way of the Pharisees and emphasized not only the written law, but the oral law. This eventually would be written down and set. The Babylonian Talmud is the basis for modern Judaism. Now, modern Judaism, drawing from these traditions, has diverged into three main branches. There are the Orthodox, that follow very strictly the law as it is presented and the traditions. We find then the conservatives that hold on to many of these but are less strict than the Orthodox, and then the Reformed Jewish tradition that essentially views the Hebrew religion as being traditional but not binding on anyone. In Reformed Judaism, for example, most of its members would not keep kosher and would not observe the Sabbath day as a day to avoid any kind of work. Many Jews also converted to Christianity and later to Islam. We read in the New Testament of thousands converting on the day of Pentecost and following. And the book of Acts tells us that many priests became obedient to the faith. And so it was that Judaism defined itself largely as not being Christian or Islamic. It rather pulled itself into a maintenance of this distinction. And we come in the first century to the origins of the Christian movement. Through our study, we've seen various backgrounds, and it's important to notice that God chose just the right time for His church to enter into this world. The backgrounds that we find, first of all, are the Hebrew backgrounds. The work that we find God doing, going all the way back not only to Abraham, but even before, in defining a people. But with Abraham, the promises were given that in him all nations of the world would be blessed. And so we find the patriarchs, Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, and then the 12. The 12 sons who would become the tribes of Israel, and through the entire scope of the Old Testament, God providing His word, preparing a people for the Messiah. We find, of course, the Greek background, especially the Greek language and culture that was spread by Alexander the Great, providing a common medium for intellectual exchange. It was in the first century that the Greek language, having spread, would serve as a vehicle for the sharing of the good news of Jesus Christ. Greek was the language of the New Testament scriptures, and it was accessible to every educated person in the ancient world. And of course, the Roman background. While the Roman Empire did persecute Christians, and we must never diminish the harm that came to so many believers, we find the Roman Empire did provide a framework, especially the Roman roads, and the relative peace, the ability to move from place to place, that you could leave Jerusalem and travel all the way up to the British Isles and still be in one government, one nation. It is interesting to me that we often talk about the missionary journeys of Paul. And certainly he was a missionary. He was one who went on a mission. And yet he never involved himself in foreign missions. By definition, all the mission work that we read of in the first century was domestic missions, for it all occurred within one nation. The Roman Empire was the stage on which the early church burst forth. And of course, the person and work of Jesus of Nazareth. Christianity is the lengthened shadow of its founder. We think about the Christ. And as Christ, he was prophet, priest, and king. The early church saw in him their all in all. He was the one who had been foretold by the Hebrew prophets, and he was the one they looked to as the Son of God. Recognizing that God himself had come into this world was a fundamental tenet of the early church. The resurrection event is one that we must touch on. There are many miracles described in Scripture, and yet it's the resurrection that perhaps provides the greatest evidence for us, because we have so many thousands of Christians in those early years affirming the truth of the resurrection, and the historical reality of this is one that we cannot escape. And we see the catalytic power of the Great Commission. Jesus told his church, "Go into all the world and teach the gospel." This proclamation of the good news of Jesus Christ caused the early church to go and to engage the culture in which they lived, and this changed everything. It changed art, it changed literature, it changed architecture, it changed philosophy. All of life was changed as the good news of Jesus Christ was commended to the best and brightest minds of the ancient world. The form and teachings of the early church described for us in the New Testament show us a group of people who were simple but not simplistic. Their doctrine was profound but not convoluted, and it was common. It was held to all people. These early Christians were gathered together into congregations, overseen by elders, served by deacons, and exhorted by evangelists. These self-governing congregations provided the framework in which the early church grew. Eventually, and it did not take much time, before changes occurred, and the early church began to abandon the simplistic organization of the first century, and there was a rise of a hierarchical church, incorporating elements of the Old Testament priesthood. Instead of an evangelist, you had a local priest. And eventually, these priests would report to an overseeing bishop. Overseers in the first century were the elders of the church, always plural in number and always in the local congregation. As we head into the second century, we find overseers taking care of large areas of territory, the rise of dioceses, and then eventually of large metropolitan areas, and the rise of monarchical bishops, one man being the bishop over an area. But of course, this is a different story for a different time, as we would enter into the study of church history, which perhaps we'll cover in another series of lessons. I hope that the lessons we have gone through on the historical backgrounds for biblical study have been useful to you. It reminds us that the Bible is not a fairy tale. It is rooted in history, and what happened in history helps us to understand the flow of the biblical narrative. Thank you so much for joining me, and I hope that you have a blessed day.